Okay. All right. So, yeah, so this is going to be an ice core talk. So there's I assume that there are a lot of new faces, new students. So I'm going to give a brief overview of ice cores. It's going to be perhaps a little too brief, but hopefully everyone will be able to understand what I'm talking about. Let me start looking at data. This is a work that's been in progress for some years now, so a lot of people have been involved in it. I put the most prominent names are up there. A lot of them are involved with UCI, or they were involved with UCI at some point. Okay. So South Pole ice core. The ice core data I'm going to talk about was drilled at South Pole. It was drilled at about 1,751 meters and from 2014 to 16. This is a picture of the drill camp. I was there personally to drill most of this ice core. You can go to our website to actually get more details if you're interested about this project. It's now defunct, but there's still a lot of cool stuff on the website. The drilling, we used what we call the intermediate depth drill. You're seeing the tilted tower right there. The sonde is about to basically go into being tilted and go into the hole. When it comes out, this is a picture right after the drill was brought up to surface with the ice core sticking out. Usually if things go well, we drill 2 meters at a time, and you see a 2-meter piece of ice core to the right. My cursor wants to disappear, and oh, okay. It's okay. So the 2-meter pieces, we actually, how do we bring them to US? We actually cut the 2-meter pieces to 1-meter pieces in the field. That's a picture of Mindy Neiswanger, who used to be a graduate student here, right after she cut a bunch of cores. So those 1-meter pieces get loaded onto these big boxes you see there. And then they get ultimately loaded onto a plane at South Pole. And then they fly to McMurdo. From McMurdo, they get on a ship. They come to California. From California, they get on a truck. They go to Denver. And Denver, they live in a big walk-in freezer and an SF facility. And then we travel to Denver to cut samples and bring samples back to Irvine. So that's how the process goes. Why are we interested in ice cores? I mean, ice cores are really a unique environmental archive. In very simplest terms, they provide really precisely dated samples of ice, obviously, essentially the precipitation over the ice sheet, and everything that's dry deposited onto the ice sheet, plus air. So those are 2 pictures you're seeing are basically bubbly, what we call bubbly ice. Ice cores are roughly 10% by air, by volume. I want to say very briefly over how the air gets into the ice, because so ice core from an ice sheet is a little different than what you get out of your freezer as ice, right? So this is the very simplified process. We have snow at the surface, and it's not to scale. Obviously, the snow is usually the thinnest section. And then the crystals are large. Air content is very high in snow, up to about 90%. And then as you go below, ice density increases, meaning crystals get small. Air gets pushed out. That means the density is increasing. And at some point, what we call in the firn, basically the air content drops. And at the, why is that? Oh, okay. So the air bubbles, what we call the lock-in zone, actually is at the very bottom of the firn. And that happens anywhere from 60 to 120 meters, roughly, range from the surface of the ice sheet. And one thing to note is down to that bubble lock-in depth, there is very efficient, fairly efficient, I should say, diffusive mixing with the overlying atmosphere. So the actual air in the ice does not age until the bubbles get locked in and firn. Whereas the ice, you can obviously see from the surface to about 100 meters, let's say, there's a lot of aging of the ice. And then, so what that means is air bubbles are actually not at the same age as the ice that they are trapped in, okay? And then if you go further below the ice sheet, if you go deep enough, actually at around 700-800 meters, even the air bubbles start to disappear because of the overhead pressure. The air itself starts to transition into clathrate phase. Okay, so that's all you're going to hear about all that. So this is just a picture of, again, the bubbly ice. And on the right-hand side, these are some pictures I actually try to take in the field of what we call clear or full clathrate ice. Okay, so clear ice is actually very difficult to take a picture of because it's actually fully transparent. But you can see what you see, the marks you see on them are mostly saw marks, the pieces that I cut. So there's a very distinct difference. Like if you look at a bubbly ice and clear ice, you can easily see, although the clear ice contains just as much air as the bubbly ice, you just cannot see it because everything is in clathrate phase. Okay, so at UCI, we use two different methods to actually get the air out. So we're going to make the air measurements, right? To do that, we have to first get to separate the air from the ice. One of them is dry extraction. Obviously, as the name implies, this is done without melting the ice. We keep the ice frozen. And the second one is wet extraction. Dry extraction is the preferred method for COS measurements. The picture you're seeing here is a picture I took in the walk-in freezer here. And these are ice samples you're looking at that I just loaded. What you have is a vacuum chamber that has a flat cutting surface inside it. We put the ice samples on it. Then it has a lid that we close and we shake that thing in a freezer. As the ice slides back and forth on the cutting surface, it gets shredded into snow and releases the air. Obviously, this is done under vacuum. The picture on the right is a picture I took after the shredding. You see at the bottom of the can, there's snow here. And then these are the bigger chunks that are left over. Obviously, this is not a very efficient process. We leave a lot of bits and chunks of ice at the end of it. So it's roughly 40 to 60, I mean, it's roughly 50% efficient in terms of you only get half of the air out of any given ice sample. And because of this reason, this method does not really work well in the bubble clathrate transition zone. I'm not get into the details, but it's just, you're gonna see in the data, there's a gap, and it's because of this. The second method we use is the wet extraction. This is actually the method that was developed for hydrocarbon measurements. Two PhD students prior to Jennifer here, Crystal, and then Mindy. Now Jennifer is using this system. In this method, we basically melt the ice at room temperature. It's close to 100% efficient in terms of extracting the air, but it's not great for soluble gases, which COS is more soluble than air because you're going to leave some of the gas in that water, which means the measurement you make is not directly the mixing ratio of that gas in the ice core air. So you're going to have to make some kind of correction. So we're going to also do that. And then the air we extract, regardless of the extraction method, they're analyzed in the same analytical system. We have a GCMS with a custom inlet. It's a pretty old instrument. It's a big magnetic sector mass spectrometer here. Let me see. Oh, this is the mass spec. This is the GC, and this is our inlet system. So it's a GCMS method. We calibrate everything ourselves. Everything is all the way from pure COS to parts per trillion level calibration. Everything is done in the house here. If you want to learn more about this, you're welcome to stop by in the lab anytime. So I'm going to now switch to COS. What's carbonyl sulfide? Okay, so carbonyl sulfide is a linear molecule, and it's often referred to as also OCS because that's how the atoms are lined up. It's basically a carbonyl group, like oxygen double bonds, carbon double bonded to a sulfur. It's important, and we care about it because it's actually the most abundant sulfur gas in the troposphere, which makes it an important source of background sulfate aerosol in the stratosphere. We care about it also because it has an interesting biogeochemistry. So its primary removal process is by plants during photosynthesis. I'm going to touch on this a little more later in the talk. So it can be used as a proxy for gross primary production. And its emissions are primarily from the oceans. So it's an interesting trace gas in terms of sources are from the oceans, natural sources are from the oceans, and sink is in the terrestrial biosphere. So what are the ocean sources? The ocean source of CO is a little complicated. Oceans actually emit COS as COS directly, plus carbon disulfide, CS2, and dimethyl sulfide, DMS. CS2 and DMS are short-lived gases. So as soon as they come out of the ocean, not as soon as, but within hours to days, they get oxidized, and some COS comes out as a result of the oxidation. It's not the only oxidation product of these gases, but it's produced as a result of oxidation of CS2 and DMS. Actual quantities of emissions are highly uncertain. Like many trace gas budgets, COS budget is also in flux, and we don't really know it very well. But I put the best numbers I can come up with. The direct COS emissions are, I put some uncertainty estimates there. You can see they're fairly large, about 50%. You can attribute anywhere from 200 to 500 gigograms sulfur per year. This is observationally constrained. These are not like, I'm not talking about top-down modeling type stuff, but actual measurements based, like ocean-going measurements based estimates. Anthropogenic sources are actually quite important. They have been on the flux. I listed some estimates, how it's been growing over the years. In fact, I actually think it might even be a little bigger than 400 gigograms sulfur. So there's a chance in the present day atmosphere, they may actually be larger than the ocean sources. But that doesn't really concern us that much, because anthropogenic sources are not going to factor into the interpretation of the ice core record, simply because there was no anthropogenic source roughly prior to 1900. It's safe to assume that, I think. Another source is burning, both biomass and biofuel burning. In terms of burning, COS is mostly, we're talking about actual COS emissions in the form of COS. This is a relatively small source. I'd give it about 100, 150 gigograms sulfur per year. Every now and again, it doesn't. Okay, and then finally, the more minor or uncertain sources, one of them is wetlands and anoxic systems. So I put there, not clear there, they are a net source. So that's where the literature is. So generally speaking, overall, the wetland or anoxic ecosystems, because there are multiple sources and sinks that exist there, it's not clear on a global scale whether they're actually a sink or a source. It could actually be a small sink. It could be a source up to a couple hundred gigograms sulfur per year, given the literature out there today. And then volcanoes, like many sulfur gases, they emit some COS, but even though there's a large uncertainty, I think it's pretty certain that they're pretty minor sources, less than 100 gigograms sulfur per year. So overall, anyway, so I'm going to move to the sinks now. Those are the sources. The largest sink is non-wetland ecosystems, terrestrial ecosystems. And that's anywhere from 600 to 1200 gigograms sulfur. And the partition is thought to be roughly 90% plants, 10% soils. But I wouldn't bet on it. You know, that seems to change a lot. It has been changing. There's some chemical source in the atmosphere. There's OH, it gets oxidized by OH in the atmosphere. There's a direct photolysis of it, and some of it goes into the stratosphere and get destroyed there. That accounts for roughly about a couple of hundred gigograms sulfur per year. And this is basically the total budget. To the best that I can, I put some percentages there. You can see the largest sink is non-wetland ecosystems. The largest source is the oceans, pretty close to the anthropogenics. If you look at the totals, there seems to be still some missing sources. So things are not balanced, but the lifetime is on the order of a couple of years, which is long enough for it to be reasonably well mixed between the two hemispheres. So you look at Antarctic ice cores, I think we can assume that we're looking at a global picture It's not really a local Antarctic atmosphere type picture. And finally, this is the present day distribution of it. This is from a 2007 paper from NOAA Flask Network. If you look at the, I mean, these are some NOAA station acronyms that you don't really need to understand them nor know them, but South Pole is right there in the south at 90 degrees south. You can see it's roughly 500 parts per trillion. That's the mixing ratio. The global mean is actually just under 500. You can see that the lowest mixing ratios are observed annually over continental northern hemisphere sites. That's because the uptake is concentrated over those places. And there's a little more in the southern hemisphere than north because the sources are obviously the oceans are more in the southern hemisphere versus the sink is more in the northern hemisphere. Okay, so that's all you're going to hear about COS biogeochemistry present day. I'm going to now switch to ice core measurements. So this is our data set. And here you're seeing two different data sets. The blue markers are the dry extraction method measurements, and the red are the reds. So the x-axis here, I use time, and you can see it says age there, and the unit is KY, which is kilo years. And the 55 on the left is actually the past. That's 55,000 years before present. And the 0 on the right is the present. And we define present as the calendar year 1950. So every plot you're going to see versus time will be going from left to right, and the units will be in kilo years. Okay, and you can see there's a gap in the dry extraction data between 10 to 23 kby roughly, and that's the bubble collapse rate transition zone I mentioned earlier. And the other thing you obviously notice is that the red extraction data is offset from the dry extraction, and that is because I'm showing you the raw measurements. These are not corrected for the solubility. So the first thing we're going to do is to correct it for solubility. Now, the way we did this is I didn't just look at the difference and multiply by a fixed number. There's actually an empirical method that I used. I'm not going to try to explain it here because I wasn't going to have enough time, but the correction factor is roughly 20%. We feel pretty confident we're measuring the same thing with both extraction methods. And most of the difference is accounted for between the methods is accounted by the solubility. There are some obvious flyers out there in the red extraction method. So there's some other secondary things that are going on. I don't necessarily understand what's going on, but essentially this is our data set. Okay, this is the data set we're going to use. So I put the present day annual mean up there at 500 ppt, the dashed line on top. So one thing to notice is that nearly all of the measurements, and there are about, I think, 550 data points that you're looking at right now, are less than, most of them are less than the present day mixing ratio, especially the Holocene, which is the interglacial period we're in, say prior to Anthropocene, if we go with that definition, doesn't matter. So if you look at those measurements from the last roughly 12,000 years, you can see pretty much all of them are way below present day levels, and that is due to the anthropogenic impact primarily due to anthropogenic impact on the COS budget. As I mentioned, anthropogenic sources are quite an important part of the budget of the present day COS in the atmosphere. Okay, so some other things to notice. I put a line through about 16K there. You'll notice that there's more variability in the data set prior to that date. And there's also a slight long-term increase towards the last glacial maximum, which is, I'm defining it as from 30 to 18K. That's roughly the definition of last glacial maximum. It's defined as the largest ice sheet extent and presumably the coldest average temperatures on the planet for the last glacial period. Okay, so last glacial maximum was essentially the coldest period during the last glacial period. Okay, so one thing that worried me, I mean, looking at some prior data sets as well, is that ice impurity layers are, I mean, this is a trace gas research in ice core is always about this is they're high during the last glacial period, and we always worry about production of these gases in the ice sheet, especially when the ice impurity layers are high. So this is the first high resolution data set we have from last glacial period. So I wanted to see if actually there was something potentially going on with this data before we started the interpretation of it. So that's what we're going to look at next. So to look at COS production from impurities, as I mentioned, there's a difference between the gas age and ice age. So I have to now switch to the depth space. So I plotted the same data set. You're looking at the exact same data set now plotted versus depth. And because the age scales non-linearly with depth, the data actually looks quite different, right? All the Holocene is now stretched out, and all the glacial data now is like squished into like a smaller depth range. But that's commonly what happens with the ice core data. So now we're going to look at impurities from the same depth, essentially in the ice that are basically co-located with the measurements, the gas measurements we made. So usually I'm going to use ionic impurities. I'm just showing you one example here as the sea salt sodium plotted underneath the COS data set. Again, both data sets are measured versus when you can plot them versus depth. They're obviously coming from the same depth. And I noted the glacial, what I call glacial ice. That includes glacial, last glacial maximum and prior to that. And keep in mind that goes back roughly to 55K. And then the Holocene is ice, as you know, you can see there's a lot less impurity. So we analyzed the data for possible correlation with many impurities. And we found that the sea salt sodium and other sea salt related ions are significantly correlated with COS, whereas the terrestrially sourced impurities did not display much weaker correlations or not at all. So to explain what we did, so this is the same figure. Now at the bottom panel, I plotted COS on the left y-axis. The blue traces COS data from above, the dry extraction measurements. And on top of it, I overlaid sea salt sodium interpolated to the COS measurement beds. And then basically that's what the red traces. I obviously put some offset so they actually perfectly overlap. So then once we have sea salt sodium data at the same depth as your COS measurements, then you can do correlation analysis. So we find very significant correlations, but not in the high frequency content of the COS data, but more in the low frequency. Essentially what you can pick up with your eye here. There's a lot of common trends, primarily in the glacial data. So for this analysis, instead of, we didn't use simple linear regression. That's why you're actually seeing two slopes in these plots. One of them is the standard linear regression. The other one is what we call an errors in variables analysis, or like it's close to an orthogonal regression type thing, because our x-axis data, the impurity data, also has errors. These are the full probability distributions of the slopes that we found. We use numerical methods to do this analysis, and I'm not going to explain it here, but if you're interested, we can talk about it. In fact, Francois can teach you all about it at some point. So the cool thing about this is when we actually apply the full probability distribution of the slope to make the correction. So we propagate all the uncertainty associated with this correction into the corrected data. So the error bars you're going to see from here on out include the uncertainties that result from this correction. Okay, so now this is the corrected COS data. So now you can see I switched back to time. So this is past, this is present. So I'm calling this the atmospheric history now. This is what we think the atmospheric COS did. Okay. So a couple of things to notice. One of them is COS is really low during the last glacial period. It's roughly about a factor of 2 from mostly the Holocene data. It's the lowest at the beginning of the last glacial interglacial transition. And that increase from the minimum to Holocene is roughly by a factor of 3 to 4. And the gray bands you see are actually 2 sigma bands for the average COS levels for the dry extraction data. The wet extraction data, I'm showing individual error bars for each measurement. Those are actually 1 sigma error bars for the individual measurements. And there are some spurious looking, there's that peak there right around 20K, and there's a few other data points here, a couple of other ones. I don't actually know what they are, and I didn't honestly put too much thought into what they could be. I think that there's still a good chance that because of the solubility correction involved in the beta extraction data, something funny might be going on. So the rest of the talk, we're just going to focus on the causes of sustained long-term COS changes. And that's going to be primarily that factor of 2 change from glacial to Holocene and factor of 3 to 4 that happens during the transition. So when I started looking at this, I mean, if I looked at a lot of ice core data, obviously, and it immediately jumps out at me that, oh, this looks really similar to atmospheric CO2. What atmospheric CO2 did, obviously, from ice cores, we know very well what atmospheric CO2 did over the last 50,000 years. So this is the 2 records plotted. COS is above, CO2 is below from Antarctic ice cores. And I also plotted a little Antarctic cold reversal period because there's a little flattening there in COS as well. So you can see both gases are obviously low. We know from CO2 low during the glacial period and high during the Holocene. And there's a flat print, and then there's essentially a concurrent rise during the last glacial interglacial transition. There's also a difference though. I mean, obviously, if you look at relative changes, you know, like I mentioned, from the low point in COS, the change is about a factor of 3 to 4 times, whereas CO2 increases by roughly 50%. Now, this is quite interesting because, as I mentioned earlier, the biogeochemistry is actually, there's that plant uptake term in the COS biogeochemistry that actually is tied to atmospheric CO2 levels. Okay, so the first thing that I did was to explore, could this CO2 rise actually, could it actually have an impact on atmospheric COS? And actually there's a mechanism that it might change COS levels. So this is how it goes. This is a very short summary of it. I mean, people have done leaf scale chamber experiments and looked at COS uptake along with CO2. And what they find is, you know, this is the summary of this work is that COS uptake is actually proportional to gross parameter productivity and leaf relative uptake of the 2 gases, and inversely proportional with the CO2 level. Okay. So what that means is if you, that's basically this equation right here. And if you replace in that equation COS uptake by an uptake rate constant times COS mixing ratio, essentially a first order uptake rate equation, you can get to the equation at the bottom, which is 1 over K, which will equal to the lifetime of COS, atmospheric lifetime of COS with respect to plant uptake. Remember, which accounts for almost all of the COS removal from the atmosphere, is equal to atmospheric CO2 levels divided by gross primary productivity times the leaf relative uptake of these gases. So now this equation should tell, that tells us is if we, and I put the picture there again, if the CO2 levels go up, and if you do not change, if you do not change the GPP times LRU, you're going to increase the COS lifetime. And you can actually increase atmospheric COS levels without actually doing anything else. Okay, that's what this equation tells you. But going from glacial to the Holocene, the GPP times LRU remain constant. Obviously, we wouldn't expect it to remain constant, right? So there's some work that has been done on that. So this is actually a modeling work. What you're looking at is, I think, a fairly realistic, at least realistic as far as we know today. I mean, this work is from 2011, but I don't think things have changed that much since then. So that's basically a picture of the land surface in the world during the last glacial maximum on the left versus during the pre-industrial Holocene on the right. And what happens here is when you go from LGM conditions to Holocene conditions, obviously ice coverage decreases, forests and savanna areas, coverage areas increase dramatically. And the result of this is, at least in this modeling work, is about a 50 to 60% increase in GPP. And there's also an increase in the leaf relative uptake, which comes from the transitioning from a C4 dominated land plant into a C3 dominated land plant landscape during the Holocene. Okay, so that 50 to 60% is pretty much equal to the change in the CO2 we saw, right, from that equation, if you remember the numerator and the denominator. There's also some other data, independent data, that people also look at the stabilizers of oxygen, O18 of oxygen in the atmosphere is also used as a tracer of changes in GPP. I mean, there's quite a bit of modeling that goes into that too, but there's that one example of a recent paper that also found about 40% increase in GPP from LGM to Holocene, primarily looking at O18 of atmospheric oxygen as a primary constraint on the GPP. So there seems to be consensus in literature in terms of which way the GPP has gone, going from glacial conditions to the Holocene, and it's in a way that that basically balances out the change in CO2. Okay, so there's really no reason to think that atmospheric lifetime of COS changed all that much, going from the last glacial period into Holocene. If anything, it may have actually dropped a little bit. That's what the best guess estimates for GPP tell us. So I conclude from here that the COS increase was actually source driven. So, and then the similarity to CO2 could be due to a common physical process that has driven CO2. And before we do that, I want to have a quick look at the sources of COS. So just as a reminder, now I said natural sources there on the upper left. So I basically dropped out the anthropogenic sources from the budget I showed you earlier. And the percentages are basically recalculated with some ranges there because we don't know for sure. So oceans obviously become the dominant source once we take away the anthropogenic emissions, and we're left with biomass burning and then wetlands and volcanoes. So biomass burning, we don't know this for a fact, but it likely increased from the glacial period into the Holocene. In my opinion, the best, one of the best publications out there that speaks to impact of the changes in biomass burning in atmospheric trace gases is that Bach et al. Paper from 2000, I think it's 2017 actually, I think I put the date wrong, but based on the isotopic composition of methane from ice cores, they estimate roughly, the best guess is like it increased 50 to 100%. Now it looks like a large change, but considering how small biomass burning is in the COS budget, if you change biomass burning by 50%, or even if you double it, you're not going to have a very large impact on atmospheric COS levels, right? But at least it's moving in the right direction, right? Because the change we see in COS is so large that it tells us everything has to almost move in the same direction. But it's not large enough that you cannot derive the changes we see all by itself, biomass burning. The other one, the wetland source, obviously volcanoes and wetlands, it's really hard. I didn't want to speculate what they might have done. But I'm going to say it's also a smaller source. If anything, it has to move in the increasing direction somewhat, but it's possible that it may not have changed. We'll just say that it probably didn't decrease dramatically. But the big guy is really the oceans, right? Without the biggest source or the most important source, you really cannot have an atmospheric change this large. Okay, so why did the ocean source change? So we think that COS and CST sources are primarily chemical, but I say that with an asterisk because the production is primarily appears to be photochemical in the surface ocean, and it's tied to the breakdown of essentially organic, sulfur-containing organic matter that's in the surface ocean. For COS, there's also a so-called dark production. That is, it appears to be produced in the absence of light as well, and that has been tied to the microbial activity, microbial respiration. There's not a great mechanistic understanding of any of these. There are some hypotheses out there, but I'm not going to get into the details of it. DMS, on the other hand, the third one, is obviously DMS actually in and of itself, it is the most important source of natural sulfur into the atmosphere, aside from volcanic sulfur emissions. And it's biological, it's produced by phytoplankton. The phytoplankton obviously are also a very important source of, in fact, the most important source of sulfur-containing organic matter in the open ocean as well. So what I'm suggesting is, in my opinion, the COS, CS, and the MS production are not necessarily completely independent from each other, although we often refer to COS and CS2 as chemical sources and the MS as a biological source. There's an organic matter substrate underneath that I think combines them all. So I mentioned the similarity with CO2 could be because of a common physical process. So at this point, most of the CO2 increase, again, we don't fully understand the CO2 causes of the CO2 increase during the interglacial transition, but I think most scientists agree that the primary source of the carbon has been the deep ocean. Deep ocean is also rich in macronutrients, and this has actually been mentioned and talked about before. So that could be actually a process that can enhance, if you put macronutrients in the surface ocean. That's my running hypothesis right now, is that we can enhance biological production of organic matter, sulfur-containing organic matter, and all the ocean's COS sources might go up. And in literature, there's also talk about light availability as a limiting factor for biological matter. There's a lot of papers on both of these subjects. I didn't even try to list many, but if you just do a quick Google search, you'll see tons of literature. So sea ice changes from glacial to Holocene from the interglacial period, and the related light impacts on biological productivity in the ocean. So essentially, I'm focused on a biological mechanism, primarily because I can't really think of how to change ocean sources, how to have very large changes in oceanic sources of COS in any other way. And I'm going to end here. I'm right about 40-minute mark, I think. This is some conclusions and impacts. So I think that atmospheric COS was much lower during the last glacial period compared to present day and the past 10,000 years. I think there was a very large change in atmospheric COS that's pretty much concurrent with the glacial interglacial transition. And I think this increase, the nature of it almost requires that ocean was really heavily involved. It was primarily the COS was coming out of the oceans, the excess COS. And oceans are the most important source of atmospheric sulfur outside of volcanoes. So this actually indirectly has a lot of implications because the sulfate aerosols have fairly important implications for the radiative budget via scattering and cloud albedo feedback. And I'll stop right there and take questions.
Questions for Murat? Yeah, Francois.
Francois.
I have a question. It seems that your hypothesis for the link with CO2 increase and biological increase is reverse of what one would expect. Like if you're bringing up all this CO2, sure, the CO2 goes up, you bring up all the nutrients, but if you have a large increase in biological production, you would think that would draw down atmospheric CO2. So most of the hypotheses have it the other way, that biological production in the ocean is higher during glacial times and lower today. So your hypothesis was the exact opposite way. Then.
Yes.
Do you have any?
Well, I mean, you're saying that the export production out of the
Yeah.
zone will scale with it. Yeah, it might. I don't know how, you know that stuff better than I do. I'm not sure how that works exactly. Yeah, no, that's true. That would be the opposite direction. If the export production really increases with excess CO2,
Yeah.
the question is like how much you're actually going to produce the gross productivity versus how much you're going to increase the export production, right? So the difference would have to be in favor of having a lot more in the surface.
Yeah.
Export production where it matters in the Southern Ocean declined during the last decade. So you have increased nutrient consumption, but not increased.
Sure, or you comment, question, doesn't matter. Yeah, sure.
Like how, because I wanted to interpret all those wiggles. You told us not to, but I really want to. How far can I push like the plus or minus model?
H model errors, meaning in the
Can you
chronology.
repeat the question for those?
Oh, so Patrick is asking if I get it correctly, the uncertainties in the ice core chronology.
Yes.
Okay. So it's not very large. The chronology of this ice core, this South Pole ice core, has been tied to our best dated gas core from waste divide by methane measurements. So the way we do the ice core, I didn't touch on this, is that methane is usually what we rely on. We can measure, I mean, we don't here, but other laboratories measure methane very reliably and reproducibly. As in the waste divide ice core, which is a different spot in Antarctica. It's a high accumulation site. It gives very high resolution methane measurements. So methane they have made high resolution methane measurements in this ice core, and it has been tied to the waste divide ice core with methane and volcanic tie points on the ice age side. So I would say the uncertainty obviously changes. If you go back to the last glacial period, few hundred years, give or take. It's not thousands of years, no. Yeah, so it's not thousands of years, it's hundreds of years. You know.
Maybe I missed this, but do we have data on what non-organic sources of carbonyl sulfide are doing trend-wise right now instead of something else?
Right now. Okay, the question is, I forgot your name, but it doesn't matter.
I'm the new professor
Oh, okay. The question is, what have the non-anthropogenic sources of COS been doing in the atmosphere at present?
Yeah.
Correct? That's a very good question, and we don't know. We don't know simply because, in terms of temporal trends, I think you're asking, right? Yeah, so it's really difficult because anthropogenic sources are really dominant, and they, in my opinion at least, we recently published a paper last year that they actually change a lot. So there's a large component of the budget that's changing fast and a lot. So it's really difficult to actually infer changes in the natural components. There is I would say, a rather controversial paper from a few years back that used the Fern air records of COS to infer GPP changes during the 20th century. So what they tried to do was to assume inventory-based estimates for anthropogenic emissions. So they basically said, let's assume the bottom-up numbers for anthropogenic emissions are correct. Let's assign some uncertainty to them, and they did like a numerical inversion for GPP. So if you go that route, the GPP increase was like a 30% plus increase from roughly 1900 to the year 2000. The problem is what the COS has been doing. We know very well what atmospheric COS has been doing. That's what we're really good at measuring this stuff. The difficult part is the attribution of the causal attribution, like what causes the changes and whatnot. So because the COS hasn't been changing much, and because of atmospheric CO2 increases, so there's like an extra, I think, 10% increase in GPP you can attribute from just by looking at COS data. But I don't know if that models actually support that. And in terms of oceans, temporal variability in oceans, I don't think there's, every work I've seen, there's not a whole lot, but everybody assumes they're just constant. The production is constant. Obviously, atmospheric mixing ratio changes, that changes the ocean source a little bit, and because it changes the flux. But actually production from the ocean, we have no idea, I'd say.
And there's no like isotopic difference.
Oh, there are isotopic differences. So in terms of using COS isotopes, that work has just started. There are actually very recent papers on it. A couple of papers came out over the last couple of years, back to back, maybe even a third one. And they were mostly focused on zeroing in on the anthropogenic component, like the bulk magnitude of the anthropogenic component. And our paper actually focused on doing the same thing using Fern air stuff. And all the numbers kind of seem to converge on about roughly a 40%. So the higher end of the anthropogenic estimates that I showed you earlier, the bottom-up estimates, the observational stuff pointing in that direction. There's a lot of uncertainty in the isotopes of COS. So I think over time, I think this as we get more measurements, they may get more refined and they may start perhaps talking about changes in other sources. That hasn't happened yet. It's very new. Using the COS isotopes to infer present day changes, that's a very new field, but people are working on it. You're welcome.
Hey, any other questions? Yes.
Sorry, you just remind me, what was the correlation between sodium ions and the sulfur compound? Is it a matter of seawater contamination or something?
No. Okay, the question is, I think, why do we have COS? Why would we have COS production from sea salt sodium?
Yeah, that's right.
All right, so the sea salt sodium, I think, is just a proxy. Obviously, it's not happening from sodium. It just tells us that whatever else is coming, probably an ocean source impurity, it's leading to COS production in the ice sheet. And I didn't actually mention why it might happen. So I'm just going to speculate about it now. Obviously, the quick answer is that we don't know why it's happening. But I didn't get into that part of the data. There is evidence that this production is happening in the fern, not necessarily in the ice, meaning the part that's mixed with the surface atmosphere. And I suspect that the link could be, obviously, to produce COS, you need sulfur, and sulfur, as the ocean production of COS implies, there's sulfur in the organic matter, there's ocean source organic matter. I suspect that containing organics get deposited even over to the stenotic ice sheet, and this is pure speculation, but I suspect it could be a photochemical process that's happening in the fern that's causing that. But sea salt sodium itself is just a proxy. I believe that it's just a proxy. It looks like a conservative proxy, which is like, I think, quite useful, meaning like it doesn't seem to, I did a lot of time bracketing and looking at that correlation over like different slices of data, and it doesn't really seem to change, which is obviously a very useful thing. Otherwise, these kind of corrections can get really tricky and dangerous. Yeah. Any online questions?
Nope. One's very quiet. So if no more questions, let's thank Murat again.